woman away from the head table. Look at that dress. Goodwill must be having a sale.
Margaret stood frozen in the doorway of the grand ballroom, holding the gift she had wrapped by hand that morning. 62 years old, a widow, a retired nurse who had worked double shifts for 30 years to raise the young man standing near the altar flowers. Her son, Daniel, and his future mother-in-law had just called her an embarrassment, in front of 40 guests. Then the woman marched across the room, snatched Margaret's gift from her hands, and hurled it against the wall. Glass shattered. Someone laughed, someone raised a phone, and her own son, the boy she had given everything for, said nothing. Margaret knelt down, quietly picked up the broken picture frame, walked to the seat they had given her, the one by the kitchen door, and made a single phone call. 20 minutes later, 3 black SUVs pulled into that country club driveway, and the same people who had laughed at her could no longer look her in the eye. But here's what nobody in that room knew. The real secret wasn't in those SUVs. It was inside that broken picture frame, and before midnight, it would end this wedding. Welcome to Aging Heart Speaks. Get settled, and keep this in mind. This story was inspired by a real-life event. Drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. Trust me, you are going to love it here. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of my upcoming videos. 6 hours before that moment, Margaret Hale stood in the bedroom of her small brick house in Dayton, Ohio, looking at herself in the mirror on the back of the closet door. The dress was navy blue, simple. She had bought it 11 years ago for her husband Thomas's retirement party, the party he never got to have, because the diagnosis came first. She had taken it in at the waist herself, by hand, sitting at the kitchen table under the same lamp where she had once helped Daniel with his spelling homework. She smoothed the fabric and whispered to the empty room, "Well, Tom, our boy's getting married." On the dresser sat a photograph in a silver frame. She had wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, her gift for the rehearsal dinner. It wasn't expensive, but what was inside that frame was worth more than anything else she owned. And she had waited 26 years for the right moment to give it. She had no idea that in a few hours, she would watch it shatter against a ballroom wall. Margaret had been a nurse for 34 years. Night shifts in the cardiac unit at St. Vincent's. 12 hours on her feet, then home by 6 in the morning to make Daniel's breakfast and walk him to the bus stop. When Thomas got sick, she nursed him too. At the hospital all day, at his bedside all night. She buried him on a Tuesday and was back on shift the following Monday because the mortgage didn't grieve, and neither did Daniel's college tuition. What almost no one knew, not the neighbors, not the church ladies, not even Daniel entirely, was what Margaret had done in the years after Thomas passed. She had noticed something in those long hospital hallways. Hospitals across 3 states were desperate for experienced nurses, and the staffing agencies supplying them were run by men in suits who had never emptied a bedpan in their lives. So at 51, with her late husband's modest life insurance and a legal pad full of names, nurses she had trained, mentored, and held together through the hardest nights of their lives, Margaret started a company from her kitchen table. She called it Hale Medical Staffing. She never advertised herself. Her name appeared nowhere on the website. A managing director named Carol ran the day-to-day. Margaret liked it that way. She drove the same 14-year-old Buick. She still clipped coupons. Not because she had to, because she never forgot what it felt like to need to. Today, Hale Medical Staffing supplied over 9,000 nurses to hospital systems across the Midwest and the East Coast. And one of its very largest clients, the client whose entire network would grind to a halt without her nurses, was a hospital empire in Connecticut called Ashford Health Group. Remember that name, Ashford. It matters more than anyone in this story realizes. Daniel Hale was 30. Handsome, gentle, a little too eager to be liked. He had met Chloe Ashford at a medical conference in Boston. He worked in hospital administration. She was the daughter of the man who owned the hospitals. Richard Ashford was 63, silver-haired, the 3rd generation to run Ashford Health Group. His wife, Patricia, was 60. Patricia Ashford did not run hospitals. Patricia ran rooms, guest lists, Charity galas. Reputations. She decided, without ever being elected, who belonged and who did not. For 2 years, Daniel had dated Chloe. And for 2 years, he had somehow never quite managed to bring his mother to Connecticut. She doesn't travel well, he'd said. She's private. The truth was simpler and uglier, and Daniel could barely admit it to himself. He was afraid. Afraid of the look Patricia Ashford would give his mother's clearance rack shoes. Afraid of the questions. "And what does your family do, Mrs. Hale?" The rehearsal dinner was supposed to fix all of that. One evening, one introduction, one chance for the families to meet before the wedding tomorrow. Margaret drove the Buick 9 hours from Dayton to Greenwich, Connecticut. She stopped once for gas and a tuna sandwich. She practiced what she would say at the mirror in the gas station bathroom. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you. Daniel just glows when he talks about Chloe." She wanted so badly to get it right. She had no idea that Patricia Ashford had already decided, weeks ago, based on a single photograph Chloe had shown her, exactly what Margaret Hale was worth. The Fairview Country Club was 120 years old. Stone walls, ivy, oil portraits of stern men in the hallways. Margaret parked the Buick between a Bentley and a Porsche, and for one moment, she sat with her hands on the wheel. "Walk in like you belong, Margaret Ann," she told herself. It was what her own mother used to say, "Because you do." She carried her handbag and the tissue-wrapped gift through the tall oak doors, and a young server named Rosa, remember Rosa, she matters later, smiled at her warmly and pointed her toward the garden room. 40 guests, crystal glasses, white orchid centerpieces, a string quartet in the corner. And at the head of it all, in a champagne-colored dress that matched the drapes, stood Patricia Ashford. Patricia saw Margaret enter. Her eyes went from Margaret's face to her navy dress, to her sensible shoes, to the 14-year-old handbag, a full inventory conducted in the time it takes to draw a breath. And her smile did not fall. It calcified. "You must be Diane's mother?" Patricia said, extending 2 fingers rather than a hand. "Daniel's," Margaret said gently. "Margaret Hale. It's so wonderful to finally—" "Yes." Patricia had already turned away. "Someone will find you a seat." Someone did. At the far end of the table. The very last chair. The one beside the swinging kitchen door, which bumped Margaret's elbow every time a server passed with a tray. The nearest member of the Ashford family sat 12 seats away. Margaret unfolded her napkin, smoothed it across her lap, set her gift on the empty chair beside her, and smiled at everyone who didn't look at her. Because that's what women like Margaret do. They keep their dignity in rooms that offer them none. The first course was chilled lobster bisque. Margaret had never eaten lobster bisque in her life. She watched which spoon the woman across the table used, and used the same one. Patricia stood and introduced the guests, one by one. Judge Cartwright, Dr. Ellen Price, Senator Whitcomb's chief of staff. Each name delivered with a warm nod and a little anecdote. When she reached the far end of the table, she skipped Margaret entirely, as if the chair were empty, as if the woman sitting in it did not breathe. Then Richard Ashford rose, tall and gavel-voiced. "The Ashford name has meant something in medicine for 3 generations, he said. "My grandfather built our first hospital. My father built 5 more. Marriage." He paused, and his gaze drifted, just briefly toward the kitchen door. "Is about alignment, about making sure the people around you reflect who you are, and where you're going." Polite applause. The sound of a gate closing behind someone. 20 minutes later, Chloe's younger sister Brooke appeared at Margaret's end of the table, carrying a glass of wine and the unshakable confidence of a young woman who had never once been refused anything. "So," Brooke said, dropping into the chair beside her, "you're the mystery mother. Daniel never talks about you. What is it you do? Chloe said you were, like, a nurse or something?" 34 years, Margaret said. "Cardiac unit mostly." "Oh." Brooke nodded the slow glazed nod of someone who had already decided the answer didn't matter. "That's sweet. Very hands-on." She sipped her wine. Our family owns hospitals. 11 of them. So I guess in a way, people like you sort of work for people like us. She laughed at her own joke and drifted back to her friends. Margaret looked down at her soup. No anger. Just the bottomless patience of a woman who had been underestimated so many times it had become background noise. Like traffic. Like weather. People like you sort of work for people like us. Oh, sweetheart, Margaret thought, if you only knew. 30 seconds later, she heard the giggling. A phone raised in her direction. A photo of the old woman alone by the kitchen door, already flying through a family group chat with the caption, OMG. The groom's mom, I can't. And still, Margaret's own son said nothing. Daniel sat near the head of the table, next to Chloe, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, his fingers pressed flat against the linen, existing in the narrow space between cowardice and paralysis. Margaret caught his eye once. She smiled at him. A small, forgiving, motherly smile. He looked away. And that, more than anything Patricia Ashford would do tonight, was the thing that broke her heart. If you've ever been made to feel invisible, because of your age, your clothes, or where you come from, gently tap that like button. It tells me you're right here with Margaret. Now, back to that dinner table, because the worst moment of the night was still coming. It happened during the toasts. Patricia stood, glass in hand, and spoke about the wedding. The flowers, $40,000. The catering, $1,000 a plate. Richard and I have carried the full financial burden of this celebration, she said, and then she looked, directly, deliberately, down the length of the table at Margaret. We understand that not every family is in a position to contribute. We make adjustments. A ripple of laughter. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her chin level. Then Patricia's eyes landed on the tissue-wrapped package on the chair beside Margaret. And what is this? She walked the length of the table, heels clicking like a metronome, and picked up the gift between two fingers, the way one picks up something left behind by a stray animal. A little something from Ohio? It's for Chloe and Daniel, Margaret said quietly. For tomorrow. It was meant to be. Patricia tore the tissue paper off. Inside was the silver frame, and in the frame, a photograph. A young Margaret in her nurse's scrubs, in a hospital corridor, holding a newborn baby. Taped to the back of the frame, though no one could see it, was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Patricia stared at the photo. A picture of yourself? She laughed. One sharp note. No warmth. How wonderfully humble. You people never cease to. Please be careful with that, Margaret said. And something in her voice, some quiet steel, made the room go still. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Nobody told Patricia Ashford to be careful. Not in her own club, not at her own daughter's dinner. Not a woman in an 11-year-old dress. Get that woman away from the head table, Patricia announced to the room, her voice suddenly loud and bright and vicious. Look at that dress. Goodwill must be having a sale. Laughter. Enough of it to fill the room with the sound of cruelty wearing pearls. You come to my club, to my daughter's wedding, with a used frame and a picture of yourself, and you tell me to be careful? And then Patricia Ashford drew back her arm and threw the frame across the room. It struck the stone fireplace and exploded. Glass scattered across the hardwood. The photograph, creased and cracked, skidded face up under a serving table. And the small yellowed envelope taped to the backing tore loose and slid, unnoticed by everyone, beneath the hem of the tablecloth. Everyone but Margaret. Margaret saw exactly where it landed. Nobody moved. Brooke was filming. 2 guests were laughing behind their napkins. Richard Ashford examined his wine. Chloe stared at her plate. And Daniel opened his mouth, and closed it, and did nothing at all. Margaret rose from her chair. She crossed the room in the silence, knelt down on her 62-year-old knees among the broken glass, and gathered the pieces one by one. She retrieved the photograph. She retrieved the envelope, and slipped it into her handbag. She did not cry. She did not flinch. 34 years in cardiac units teach a woman how to keep her hands steady while her heart is breaking. She walked back to her seat by the kitchen door. She took out an old flip phone, the kind her son teased her about. She dialed a number from memory, and she said 7 words very quietly. "Carol, it's Margaret. Send the cars." Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Those next 20 minutes were the longest of the evening, and they were far from quiet. Patricia did not sit down. Sitting down would have meant surrendering the room, and Patricia Ashford had never surrendered a room in her life. "I want her out," she told Richard, loud enough for every guest to hear. "Call the front desk. I will not have my daughter's wedding weekend contaminated by this person, and her thrift store theatrics." Richard hesitated. For a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that might have been shame. Then he picked up the house phone and dialed. At the far end of the table, the young server, Rosa, appeared at Margaret's elbow with a fresh cup of coffee no one had ordered. She leaned down and whispered, "Ma'am, I saw what she did. I'm so sorry. My mother was a nurse too. 30 years. Margaret patted the girl's hand. "Then your mother," Margaret whispered back, "is a wealthy woman in all the ways that matter." Rosa would remember that sentence for the rest of her life. Daniel finally came down the table. He crouched beside his mother's chair, his face gray. "Mom, I'm sorry. That's just how Patricia is. She doesn't mean—" "Daniel." Margaret's voice was gentle. It would have hurt less if she had shouted. "I watched you say nothing. Mom, go back to your seat, sweetheart. This night isn't finished. And there's something you need to see." He didn't understand. He went back to his seat anyway. He had been obeying stronger people all his life. Patricia, meanwhile, had regained her stage. "Honestly," she announced to her end of the table, swirling her wine, "you cannot blame the woman. You can blame my future son-in-law for hiding her. 2 years, Chloe. 2 years, and no one thought to check what he came from." Laughter again, thinner this time. A few guests had stopped joining in. A man near the back of the room, an attorney named Stephen Ford who had come as a professional courtesy, sat perfectly still, his phone recording beneath the table. He hadn't planned to film anything tonight, but some things you witness and cannot keep to yourself. At 8:42 p.m., Margaret felt it before she heard it. A low hum from the gravel drive. Headlights swept across the tall windows of the garden room. One pair, then another, then a third. The valet burst through the doors, his vest crooked, his face the color of milk. "Mrs. Ashford, ma'am, there are 3 black SUVs in the drive, and a gentleman asking for—" his voice cracked, "for the owner of Hale Medical Staffing. He says she's a guest at this dinner." Every head in the room turned. Patricia laughed, confused. "There's no such person here." And from the seat beside the kitchen door, a calm voice said, "Yes, there is." Margaret Hale stood up, smoothed her navy dress, and buttoned her cardigan. "That would be me." The doors of the garden room opened, and 5 people in tailored suits walked in, led by a silver-haired woman of about 55 who crossed the room without glancing at a single Ashford and embraced Margaret like family. "Sorry it took us 20 minutes, Carol Reyes said. "Traffic on the Merit." She turned to face the room, and her voice carried the polish of 10,000 boardrooms. "Good evening, everyone. Carol Reyes, Managing Director of Hale Medical Staffing, 9,200 nurses across 14 states." She paused, just long enough. "And this is our founder, sole owner, and chairwoman, Margaret Hale." You could hear the wine still dripping from somebody's tipped glass. Richard Ashford rose slowly from his chair, and his face was something Margaret would remember for years. Because Richard, unlike his wife, understood instantly. "Hale," he said hoarsely. "HMS. Hale Medical Staffing. You're our staffing partner. He swallowed. 60% of the nursing staff across all 11 of our hospitals comes from your company. 64%, Carol corrected pleasantly. As of the January contract. The contract, incidentally, that comes up for renewal in 9 days. Patricia Ashford's champagne glass tilted in her hand. A thin stream ran down her wrist and dripped onto the hardwood floor. She did not notice. The blood had left her face all at once, like a screen going dark. That's... Patricia's voice came out in pieces. That's not possible. Look at her. I am looking at her, said Carol Reyes coldly. I've been looking at her for 11 years. I watched her sign the paychecks of half the nurses in Connecticut, including Mrs. Ashford, the nurses at the hospital where your grandchildren were born. Margaret raised a hand, gently, and Carol fell silent. Because here is the thing about Margaret Hale that no one in that room yet understood. She hadn't called the cars to humiliate anyone. Please sit down, everyone, Margaret said quietly. Carol, take a seat. I believe we were having dinner. And she returned, deliberately, to the chair by the kitchen door. The worst seat in the house. And one by one, the executive team of a company worth more than the Ashford fortune filled the empty chairs around her. The punishment seats had just become the most powerful table in the room. Patricia recovered first. She always did. Margaret. Her voice was thin now, stripped bare. Margaret, dear, if we had known, obviously the seating, the introductions, we would have done everything differently. If you'd known, Margaret said. That's exactly the point, Patricia. You treated me the way you treat everyone you believe is nobody. The only mistake you made tonight was doing it to somebody. She let that sit. Then she reached into her handbag. But I didn't call those cars for you. I called them because tomorrow morning, my company was scheduled to sign your renewal, and I wanted my directors to meet my new family first. A sad smile. That plan has changed. And now, there's something else this room needs to see. She took out the yellowed envelope. Because this dinner was never really about me. Chloe, sweetheart. Margaret looked down the long table at the bride. This is about you. If you're enjoying Margaret's story, a quick subscribe truly means the world. It's free, and it keeps stories like this coming. Because what was in that envelope, nobody in that room saw coming. The photograph, the one Patricia had called a picture of yourself, lay creased on the table now. Young Margaret in her scrubs, in a hospital corridor, holding a newborn. 26 years ago, Margaret said. I was a night nurse at St. Vincent's in Dayton. One night in March, a young woman came into my unit, 19 years old, alone. No family with her, no husband. She'd been driving through Ohio when the labor started early. Margaret's voice was steady, but soft. There were complications. For 6 hours I held that girl's hand, and just before dawn, she delivered a healthy baby girl. The room was absolutely silent. The young mother had nothing. She was frightened of someone. She never said who. Before she was discharged, she asked me to mail a letter for her, if anything ever happened. She made me promise. Then she wrote down the baby's name. Margaret looked up. She named her Chloe. Chloe Ashford had gone very, very still. Patricia's hand went to the pearls at her throat. That's absurd. Chloe is our daughter. She was born at Ashford Memorial. She was adopted through a private arrangement 4 weeks later. Margaret said gently, I know, because the adoption facilitator called my unit to verify the birth records. I never forgot the name of the family. Ashford. And when my Daniel came home 2 years ago and told me the name of the girl he loved, Chloe Ashford, 26 years old, born the second week of March. Margaret's eyes shone. I drove to the bank the next morning and took this envelope out of a safe deposit box where it had waited for 26 years. She held it out, not to Patricia, to Chloe. Your mother's letter, sweetheart. I promised her that if I ever found you, you would have it. That photograph was my gift to you. It's the only picture in the world of you and your birth mother on the day you were born. She's the one holding my hand, just out of frame. Chloe walked the length of that silent room like a woman in a dream. She took the envelope, her hands shook as she opened it. We will never know every word that letter said, but we know the last line, because Chloe read it aloud, crying, in front of 40 guests. If a stranger has been kind enough to carry this letter to you across the years, then remember, my darling girl, kindness is the only inheritance that matters. Judge every person you ever meet by that alone. Chloe lowered the letter. She looked at the shattered glass by the fireplace, at the seat by the kitchen door, at her mother, at Patricia, who had thrown the only photograph of her birth mother against a stone wall, while a room full of people laughed. "You knew I was adopted," Chloe whispered, "and you spent tonight teaching me exactly what you think people like my birth mother, people like Margaret, are worth." "Chloe, darling, don't." Chloe turned to Margaret and did the thing that made half the guests reach for their napkins. She knelt down beside the chair by the kitchen door, the worst seat in the house, and put her arms around the woman who had held her mother's hand on the night she was born. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping a promise for 26 years, to a stranger." "Oh, honey," Margaret said, stroking her hair. "Your mother wasn't a stranger. Nobody is. That's the whole point." What happened next happened quietly, the way real consequences usually do. Richard Ashford asked the guests for privacy, and for once, Patricia did not command the room. She sat down in it, small and silent, while her husband apologized, first to Margaret, and then, at Margaret's insistence, to his own daughter, which was harder and mattered more. The contract was renewed 9 days later, but with conditions Margaret wrote herself, in her own handwriting, on a legal pad at her kitchen table in Dayton. A nurse-led patient dignity program in all 11 Ashford hospitals, funded by the Ashford family, named not after Margaret, but after a 19-year-old girl who once passed through Ohio in the second week of March. The video, Stephen Ford's video, was never posted. He brought it to Margaret and offered it to her like a loaded weapon. She watched it once, thanked him, and asked him to delete it. "The people who needed to change," she said, "were all in that room. The rest of the world doesn't need to eat anyone alive on my account." He deleted it, and then he told everyone he knew the story anyway, which is how, in the end, it reached us. And Daniel. Daniel drove to Dayton the following weekend, alone. He sat at the kitchen table under the old lamp where he had learned to spell, and he cried, and he said the words his mother had waited a very long time to hear. Not, "I'm sorry you were hurt," but, "I'm sorry I was silent." "You get one of those in a lifetime, from me," Margaret told him, holding his hands. "Spend the rest of your life being the man who speaks up first. That's how you pay me back." The wedding was postponed 3 months, Chloe's decision. When it finally happened, it was not at the Fairview Country Club. It was in the garden behind a small brick house in Dayton, Ohio, 40 guests, folding chairs, and Rosa, the young server from that terrible night, hired personally by the bride, standing among the guests this time instead of behind them. Margaret sat in the front row in her navy blue dress, the same one, and in Chloe's bouquet, wrapped around the stems where no one could quite see it, was a creased photograph of a young nurse holding a newborn baby, cracked down the middle, and more precious for it. Patricia Ashford calls Margaret every Sunday now. Some weeks Margaret answers, some weeks she doesn't. Forgiveness, Margaret says, is like night shift nursing. It isn't one grand gesture. It's just showing up, again and again, until the healing takes. And here is what this story leaves us with. No one should need 3 black SUVs to be treated like a human being. No one should need a company, or a title, or a fortune to earn a seat away from the kitchen door. Because the people who only respect you after they learn what you're worth, they never respected you at all. But the quiet ones, the ones who kneel down in the broken glass, who keep a stranger's promise for 26 years, who stay steady when the whole room is laughing, they carry the only kind of wealth that no one can ever throw against a wall. So tell me, if you were Margaret, sitting in that chair by the kitchen door, would you have made that phone call? Or would you have simply walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who's ever been made to feel small. Like this video, subscribe, and tap that bell. Because here on Aging Heart Speaks, stories like Margaret's are just getting started. And remember, my friend, kindness is the only inheritance that matters. I'll see you in the next